Thank you very much for coming. My name is Satoru Nagao, who edits the report. This one, Strategy for the Indo-Pacific, Perception of the US and Like-Minded Countries. Could you please believe me, it is really true. Thanks to the contributors and Hudson colleagues, it is really happened. So I really appreciate your support and the participation today. And we would like to thank the Japan Foundation, Center for Global Partnership, for their support of this research and publication. The opinion shared in the report belongs to the authors. Today, after I introduce the report in 10 minutes, and other contributors of this report will talk perception of the US approach to countering China based on this report. So now introduction. This is a picture I took. The rise of China and its attitude towards the world forced the United States to address the challenge posed by China's ambition. Vice President Mike Pence spoke at the Hudson Institute, and this is very important, and said, Beijing is employing the full-of-government approach using political, economic, and military tools, as well as propaganda, to advance its influence and benefit its interest in the United States. So, given the United States need to win the competition, cooperation with ally and like-minded countries is key because historically, number of political partners has been a decisive factor in the geopolitical struggle. For example, in the World War I, the winning side comprised 32 countries, but the losing side was composed of just 4. In World War II, 54 versus 8. During the US-Soviet Cold War, 54 versus 26. So these facts indicate that the number of supporters correlate to the likelihood of winning the competition. Therefore, maintaining the improving collaboration with its allies and like-minded countries will be key for the United States. It is of increasingly importance to identify and understand the perceptions of those cooperating in this region. This is table of contents of this report. This report includes a view of the scholars studying the United States, 2 articles, the Vietnam, Singapore, ASEAN, Australia, India, Sri Lanka, British, France, EU, Canada, and Japan. The view from the analysis indicate that all countries in the Indo-Pacific realize the problem created by rising China. However, there are 2 different types of opinion about how to tackle the situation with China. The United States, India, Australia, and Japan have chosen a relatively strong stance toward China. And British, France, EU, and Canada are trying to cooperate with the United States' effort as a US ally. On the other hand, Vietnam, Singapore, ASEAN, and Sri Lanka are worrying about side effects of the US-China competition. How can affected parties fill this gap? That is my policy recommendation. There are 3 policy recommendations: security, economy, and power. The first one is security. Use test case scenario to demonstrate various kinds of US intervention in variety of situations. Regional countries like Vietnam, Singapore, ASEAN, or Sri Lanka are worrying about one situation. Even if regional countries choose a strong stance toward China, these countries are concerned that US and other like-minded countries will not support them enough. Thus, the US should demonstrate test case scenario to indicate what kind of intervention the US might do in various situations. Economy, create a new economic development system is not dependent upon China. The US needs to assure its allies and like-minded countries the strong position towards China will not stop the economic development of those siding with the US. Thus, economic structure itself needs to change. The US and its allies and like-minded countries should relocate their factories from China and find new markets elsewhere. Free and open Indo-Pacific vision, Trans-Pacific Partnership, Japan-EU joint infrastructure projects, Japan-India-Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, and US-Japan-Australia Blue Dot Program. Using these projects, its allies and like-minded countries need to create new economic development system. Third one, power. Accept a new approach that combines security and economics. The problem of China is caused, in part, by the image that China is rising power and the US is declining power. However, if the US side can integrate both security and economical efforts, it is still very, very powerful. For example, when we talk about safeguarding energy supply against Chinese submarine threat, we could try to build a stronger naval power. But under the current budget, it is not feasible to prepare enough naval ships to safeguard extensive sea lane communications. From 2000 to 2070, China acquired at least 44 new submarines, while the US acquired 15, even if the US one is far better than the China's one, but the number is sometimes very important. So case in point, India-UAE cooperation demonstrates this new idea. In 2080, India and UAE signed agreement allowing the UAE to set up strategic oil storage facilities in India. This agreement benefits both parties. India can use the store oil in emergency. For the UAE, even if tankers cannot go through the Strait of Hormuz, UAE can sell oil from this storage. This economic effort helps the safeguard sea lane of communications. US side can apply this India-UAE method to deal with China's submarine threat to the sea lane of communications. Countries siding with US could set up strategic oil reserve facilities in like-minded countries throughout the Indo-Pacific and share oil storage in peace and in emergencies. Because submarine cannot easily to cut this network of oil facilities, it will be hard to threaten or disrupt the supply line of countries siding with the US. This toughness would assure the strong image of the US-led security system. Thus, US side will win the competition with China, and the collaboration with US allies and like-minded countries, including Vietnam, Singapore, ASEAN, Australia, India, Sri Lanka, UK, France, EU, Canada, and Japan, will be key. Of course, other allies or like-minded countries also will be key. So now is the time. Make America great leader again. Thank you very much. And the introduction has finished, and the panel discussion will start. The Pacific Chair at Hudson Institute, Dr. Patrick Cronin, will lead the panel discussion. So could you please help me?
Let me congratulate Dr. Nagao, for an excellent presentation. You can read the report, and there's a lot of material and a lot of breadth to the discussion about these like-minded countries and how they're pursuing security in the Indo-Pacific broadly. I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm the Asia-Pacific Security Chair here at Hudson Institute. We've got a really distinguished panel here to discuss a variety of views. So I'm going to dig right in by just offering a few initial comments from a U.S. perspective, not a U.S. policy perspective, but my own perspective. And let me try to amplify on the larger questions, rather than give you talking points here. The first point is simply to say that strategy is something that is an overused word. I overuse it. It's overused in this town. It's not often actually meant literally in terms of providing a real strategy. There have been questions about the coherence of China's strategic approach. Does China really have a coherent strategy? My colleague Ryan Newhart and I have written a pretty hard-hitting report last month called Total Competition, in which we certainly imply they have a coherent strategy, but even we have questions about how coherent it is. We're simply trying to look at the different facets of what is a very broad-based strategy that is trying to allow China to get its way by all means short of war. There's no doubt that unfortunately over the last decade or so, China, especially under Xi Jinping, has been more assertive in the region. I think there's been an absence of significant cost imposition on Beijing and a lack of concerted pushback. But I think this panel, this report, in fact, is an indicator that times are changing. There's a gathering reaction slowly to China's assertiveness, and one that the Chinese can't blame simply on the narrative, the propaganda point that America is trying to contain China and prevent its rise in its rightful center stage on the global sort of stage. The reality is, no, there's a lot of concern around the region and around the world about China's actions and how China will fit in. And now, of course, China and Xi Jinping are both on their back foot. So we're not wishing the Chinese people ill, especially at a time when they're fighting a shared epidemic in the coronavirus. But there's no doubt the slowing of the economy in China, the mismanagement of information, in particular about that spread of the virus, is really calling questions about, is China really the big power that it even aims to be in the 2020s? It's not starting off the decade on a high point. I do want to say that from a U.S. policy perspective, the Trump administration actually deserves credit for a couple of things on Indo-Pacific strategy. The first is simply trying to codify Indo-Pacific strategy and bring India and bring the two oceans, the confluence of the two great oceans, as Prime Minister Abe and India and Japan talked about years ago, into a more strategic focus. I think this has been a very helpful enlargement of the playing field, including when you bring Indo-Pacific, and I just came back from Paris and having rich discussions with the Europeans on this. As soon as you make Indian Ocean part of this broader strategic playing field, it allows Europe to enter in that discussion in so many ways, because Europeans see the direct interests. Yes, France has huge equities inside the Asia-Pacific, but all of Europe can see the glide path, when you think about Indo-Pacific, about their equities, and that's very important. I think the other thing the Trump administration did, although they didn't always give the Obama administration credit, but the pivot, the rebalance to Asia, which was under-resourced, but the conceptual framework of the rebalance, people like Randy Schreiber have given credit to predecessors on this issue. I think this is an evolution of American thinking in this century about the enlargement of this Indo-Pacific and why this is going to matter so much in the 21st century. So I think that's very important. The free and open Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, for instance, that was issued by the Pentagon last May, followed up by a State Department report to show a certain whole of government sort of approach. These are the right principles in that report, in my view. Sovereignty is respected no matter a country's size. That should be a principle that we should all rally around. International law and norms are respected and upheld. We should all uphold that norm itself. Trade is free, fair, open, and reciprocal. A little more contentious because you get into definitions of what exactly is fair, what exactly is reciprocal. But it's the right basic principle around which we can have a discussion. And then disputes are resolved peacefully. That fits in well with the interests of all the countries represented in this volume, I believe. The U.S., though, has been very still heavy on the defense side of our approach to the region. It was Randy Schreiber who last week said, America basically did repeal without replace when it came to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That is, we walked away from the big trade economic package without coming up with a quick substitute for it. We didn't follow up with quick bilateral free trade agreements. And we've had trouble building the kind of architecture and finance that we actually start to see accumulating in terms of things like the Development Finance Corporation. So that may be about to change, but it's taken us 3 years as a country to kind of fill in that economic basket of engagement in the region, and that's critically important for all of the countries here. But the 3 lines of effort in the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report from DoD, increasing the lethality of the joint force for great power competition, that's clearly something the United States needs to do to reassert itself, to make sure that its presence has credibility and can deter, but it's not mostly what the region wants to hear from us. Yes, officials want to know that the United States have that capability, but they want to hear about our economic engagement. They want to hear how we're going to manage the China relationship, and that's why being too successful on that aspect without also marrying it up with some of the economic shows you the strategic challenge the U.S. faces to have a balanced strategy that's sustainable and compelling. The other 2 facets of the DoD report, building relations with emerging partners and strengthening alliances, yes, absolutely. We need to be doing that. But America's messaging on that, as you know, is not always consistent. I'll just leave it at that for a moment. And the third point, encouraging U.S. allies and partners in like-minded countries to cooperate with one another. Well, this panel, I think, underscores exactly that point. Dr. Liao, again, gets credit for actually organizing, herding the cats of the region to try to talk about why we do share so many interests. And there's ample room for improvement on all these things. I do want to just say briefly that, again, 3 things that the U.S. needs to do better here is we need to define our approach to China in a more compelling fashion. And by that means a more holistic fashion. All of our countries rely on China as part of the global economy, even though we're all at risk, too, of predatory sort of procedures by China, not constrained by the rules that we are constrained by. So strategic competition, yes, the Trump administration gets that right. That is a priority because the United States woke up after a decade of sleeping on the job, and we were cooperating, as John Lee says in his new report, while they were competing. And that's exactly right. So there was a natural backlash that the Trump administration pursued here in terms of needing to put a priority on strategic competition. But strategic competition is not the whole of the U.S.-China relationship. We know that from the trade deal. We know that from ongoing talks with China. So we need to be a little more surgical about what we're talking about when we're talking about competition with China. We're talking about competition at the same time we have a cooperative relationship. Yeah, they both coexist, and they will continue to both coexist. That's part of this bound competition. And same thing with decoupling. So as soon as people want to say we're going to decouple with China, well, what exactly are we talking about? So if we're talking about 5G telecommunications, if we're talking about artificial intelligence, if we're talking about the high-tech sectors in the Made in China 2025 strategy of the 2015 10-year strategy they put together, yes, we do need to disentangle from that and make sure that we're protecting our national security in the digital age. But at the same time, we're not decoupling and divorcing our economies wholly the way that some want to jump to that conclusion. So first point here is to make sure the U.S. going forward better differentiates what we're trying to achieve here with China and what we're not trying to achieve, because that will make it for a more compelling strategy to rally others around, because that's what we share. We share not total decoupling. We share protecting our national security and our sovereignty and the rules, but while trying to figure out a way to cooperate with China. Secondly, we need to bring to the table more trade and investment development, as I've talked about. Again, I think we're finally seeing some movement here with the Development Finance Corporation, the private sector, allies coordinating to an unprecedented degree, and we'll talk more about that in the future. And third point here is we need to better answer to where Southeast Asia fits in, or where Korea fits in. And I think there are good answers to this. We're about to hear from Richard Hadarian, who's one of the best analysts from Southeast Asia. But I do think, the original fear here is that we were so successful in growing this U.S.-India relationship. And the Raisina Dialogue, which is one of the big, annual regional strategic dialogues now, has there was a good article on this just this last week. It sort of chronologically maps the Raisina Dialogue, this annual dialogue, about how we went from kind of trilateral cooperation to quadrilateral cooperation to quadrilateral plus cooperation. It's sort of been a map of the growing, expanded, like-minded cooperation in the region. Unfortunately, from a Southeast Asian perspective, that looks menacing, because the whole idea of Southeast Asia is that these are smaller countries that fear big powers fighting over them or fighting in their area. And if the quadrilateral sort of strategic dialogue or relationship is too successful, it may jeopardize the sovereignty, the autonomy of Southeast Asian countries. And so that's the concern. It doesn't have to, though. And in fact, most Southeast Asian countries, all maritime Southeast Asian country leaders, except for one, Richard, right now, wants more U.S. engagement. And we'll talk about which one that is. But I think I'm hopeful because although your president doesn't love Americans, we love Filipinos, and Filipinos actually love Americans. So I think we have a lot in common there. I think, though, the like-minded countries bring a certain not only capacity, not much in values, but also a sort of speed and pace at which Southeast Asia's institutions, as central as they remain. ASEAN cannot move very quickly when you have a lowest common denominator approach. So when Cambodia's Hun Sen can undermine the communique that talks about the South China Sea, or secretly sign a deal to allow China access to the Sea of Thailand, that's not a very fast pace of cooperation that we're talking about here to sort of keep a favorable balance of power. But with India and with Europe and with Australia, with Japan, with the United States, with others, yeah, we can do a lot to support Southeast Asia's strategic autonomy and economic growth and prosperity. So I'm going to leave it there, and I want to just now again thank this great panel, because my last thought here is that our shared aim should be, not to contain China. That's Beijing's propaganda point. A lot of Chinese believe it too now, because they've been selling themselves on this point. We are not trying to contain China. No, that shouldn't be our aim. We are trying to deny any single power exclusive control over the South China Sea, over the Indo-Pacific, and China has a shared interest in that, actually. They won't see it now, but eventually maybe they will. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Richard Hadarian, who is a resident analyst, among many other things, at GMA Network, which, if you don't know, is the large commercial TV radio network in the Philippines. He's the author of many things, including the recent book, The Indo-Pacific, Trump, China, and the New Struggle for Global Mastery. And I'm going to have, Richard, I know has some PowerPoint slides. He's the only one on the panel, so he's going to go up to the podium here. Richard.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here again, and thank you very much, Satoru-san, for arranging this and the publication. I would like to also add that we Filipinos love the United States, but we also love our president. Okay. That's where the problem is, right? I have 10 countries and more than 10 colorful people to cover within 10 minutes, but I'll try my best. Now, let me make it very clear that ASEAN is not necessarily Southeast Asia. If you're talking about ASEAN as an organization, it's more like a small and medium enterprise with no human rights. So it's quite different from key Southeast Asian countries that I'll try to focus on today. Hopefully one day we'll have more people within ASEAN. I left my clicker. You got me excited too much, Patrick. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about ASEAN and China relations. Of course, when we talk about China, we're talking about certain policies of the ruling regime in China, not the great Chinese people, and we hope the best for them amid the current epidemic. I think if you want to understand how specific countries in Southeast Asia or across the Indo-Pacific are dealing with China, I think the Kubler-Ross grief cycle is very important. Ironically, it seems countries outside the ASEAN seem to be more in the acceptance stage, meaning the challenge from China and the necessity to respond accordingly. While when we talk about Southeast Asian countries, I think we fall within the spectrum between bargaining, literally in the case of Malaysia, when Prime Minister Mahathir was trying to renegotiate deals with China. And in the case of the Philippines, we're somewhere between denial on the part of the president and anger on the part of people. So it seems even internally, there are some diversities there. Now, the fact of the matter is that the situation has been considerably worse in the South China Sea over the past few years. If you look at the militarization that is happening there, it's no longer just reclamation. You have the deployment of surface-to-air missiles and all sorts of different military equipment, so much so that Admiral Davidson properly talks about the Great Wall of SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, not only Great Wall of SANS in terms of reclamation activities. And it's also worrying for us to see that China now is brazenly and openly treating the Coast Guard of China as part of the PLA Navy. So we no longer have this kind of blaring or distinction between Great Hall and White Hall. And more worryingly, in recent times, we are also seeing what I call the militiaization of the disputes, whereby China is more aggressively using militia forces to harass the supply lines of other countries, and in some cases, even engage in aggressive actions against the vessels of other countries, as we saw in the case of the Philippines last June. The good thing is that there is an element of pushback because there's an element of acceptance of the strategic threat that is posed by China's policy, specifically in the South China Sea. In the case of Trump administration, we see more regularized freedom of navigation operations in ways that we didn't see before. They're more flexible, they're more aggressive. They're also expanded in scope, covering new geographic areas like the Scarborough Shoal, which was not covered in the past, and of course that's very important to us. We see our European friends also joining the fray, not exactly in the same way. They're not exactly conducting freedom of navigation operations, but they're conducting at least some sort of strategic presence in the area that sends the right signal to China that this is not just about US and China competition. This is about the concerns of international community, about certain actions of China that are not in consonance with international law. I think that's where the European presence in the area is extremely important. Our Australian friends have been also doing their things, among other things. I'm sure the next speaker will talk about it. India, Japan, among others. Now, the fact of the matter, though, is when it comes to ASEAN, specifically certain countries within ASEAN, like the Philippines, I'm no longer even sure we're still a US ally or whether how like-minded we are. But what's very clear is that under President Duterte, we see a significant recalibration of the Philippine foreign policy. And that is a concatenation of multiple factors, including President Duterte's campaign, his landslide electoral victory, even though during his election, he was not only questioning the Philippines' liberal democratic institutions and values, he was also questioning the Philippine alliance with America. So when he won that election handily, he felt vindicated. He felt that the Filipino people will stand by him if he wants to change the foreign policy of the country. The second is the authoritarianization or colonization of multiple branches of the government. We increasingly see that over the past few years that President Duterte is facing less and less resistance and more compliance from different branches of the state, and increasingly even outside the state mechanisms itself. Third, under the Obama administration in particular, we saw a lot of strategic ambiguity. In fact, we saw ambiguity, not much of strategy. This was very clear during the Scarborough Shoal crisis, when there was a sense that we were abandoned by America. And even just right after the arbitration award came out in July 12 of 2016, it was not very encouraging to see President Obama sending Susan Rice, not to Manila, but to Beijing. And it looked like the US was trying to appease China as if they were the aggrieved party, not the Philippines, which was actually able to prove that China was an outlaw in the South China Sea. At the same time, we saw that Chinese were more effective in making their bargain with the Philippines clear. If you go for a soft landing, you don't assert your rights, we're going to be nice to you, not conduct aggressive actions within your waters, and offer you economic deals. And lastly, this is very important, we see a very brazen personalization of Philippine foreign policy. It might sound familiar to you guys. We see words like I, me, and myself a lot as essentially the raison d'etat of the Philippines. And if you look at the latest decision of the Philippines, of course, I'll talk about that very quickly. Well, just to go to the details, I don't have much time. The fact of the matter is that under President Duterte, while the Philippine US Alliance has been there and the Visiting Forces Agreement was operational not until long ago, he actually also played certain breaks or certain blockages in terms of operationalization of the alliance. For instance, there were two important bases, Basa Air Base, which is close to Scarborough Shoal, and Antonio Bautista Air Base, which is close to Spratly Group of Islands. under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement of 2014, the US was supposed to preposition weapons and equipments there as some sort of deterrence against further Chinese encroachment, and yet President Duterte nixed that ability by the Americans, and that significantly hampered the cooperation of two countries to keep China in check. The other worrying thing was also what I call mayor's diplomacy. While China was not very successful in terms of having defense cooperation with the armed forces of the Philippines, which retains good relationship with the United States, at least until recently, China was able to gain more and more military access in Davao, which is where President Duterte comes in. So there was some sort of a backdoor military diplomacy going on, including this unprecedented and increasing access and presence of Chinese aircraft and vessels in Davao port and Davao facilities. Nonetheless, the Philippine military tried its best to keep the alliance together, including the return of war games, Balikatan exercises, and their expansion in the South China Sea, including expansion of joint military activities. In fact, last year we had 280 with America, the highest among any American Indo-Pacific partner, and this year we plan to have 318 of them. Nonetheless, of course, in light of festering human rights disputes between the United States and the Philippines, particularly the imposition of travel ban against some of the top officials and inner circles of President Duterte, he first threatened to get rid of VFA. Probably was looking for a quid pro quo, whereby he would keep the VFA in exchange for non-imposition of travel bans or return of visa. It seems he realized the quid pro quo might not work, so he went for the jugular. So without the VFA, it's very hard to see how the alliance will be as operational near anywhere it should be, because the VFA, the Visiting Forces Agreement, is the software of the alliance. It provides a legal framework for the entry and rotational stationing of American troops. So in its absence, the alliance is like an empty shell, a CPU without an operating system. And this is a significant problem that we have in our alliance. Nonetheless, President Duterte is clearly out of step with public sentiment. American approval rating is just as high as President Duterte's own approval rating, so that's where we got a problem. While China's approval rating, the latest one, is close actually to negative 33. So you got 100 points difference between the two. When you look at surveys of people, what they want the government to do in the South China Sea, many of them, actually 9 out of 10 Filipinos, want the government to take a stronger stance. Nonetheless, President Duterte can get away with what he wants because more and more Filipinos are also practical. They pragmatically welcome engagement over confrontation with China. And this explains why President Duterte can get away with what he's doing, because the public also is embracing some elements of his pragmatic approach, or quote unquote. Now, that's not the end of the deal. President Duterte himself made it clear that there are certain red lines in the South China Sea. One of them is the Scarborough Shoal. In my opinion, if China reclaims or militarizes the Scarborough Shoal to take advantage of the VFA vacuum right now, that could force Duterte's hands. And if not Duterte, certain people within the military and the defense establishment. So it remains to be seen how China will exploit the current gap in US-Philippine alliance. Now, the situation is not really depressing if you look at the bigger picture, you zoom out from the Philippines, because if you look at the case of Malaysia, for instance, under Prime Minister Mahathir, for 6 months you saw very aggressive pushback on the issue of Chinese infrastructure investment. You had 4 months of Prime Minister Mahathir recalibrating and saying things nice about China, and then boom, last December we saw surprise. He submitted what was supposed to be submitted by the Razak administration in May 2017. So he submitted the extended continental shelf claim, jutting northwards, directly challenging China's claims in the area. And by the way, this is May 2017, so it was crafted few months after the Philippine Arbitration Award came out, which clearly questioned the legal basis of the arbitration award. And of course, when Malaysia was criticized by China, Foreign Minister Saifuddin very clearly, and this is quite an unprecedented language we hear from our Malaysians, called the 9-dash line ridiculous and openly talk about the possibility of an arbitration case against them. Now, I'm not saying Malaysia is going to go all the way, but we see some significant and positive shift in that direction. Vietnam, well, I was a little bit disappointed with them because we were expecting them to also do a parallel case when the Philippines was forwarding an arbitration award under the previous administration. They waited it out. Now, for a time, they were on their own. But now as the ASEAN chairman, let's see what Vietnam is going to do. If you look at the initial statements coming out of ASEAN, it's much more aggressive, or at least much more assertive than we saw in the past. And of course, Indonesia. Even though they're under a president like Jokowi, who's known for his developmental approach, who's known for trying to seek as much investment as possible from China, we saw that he could not deny the public backlash in Indonesia in light of more and more aggressive intrusion by China into the Natuna Islands. So now, effectively, because of the expansive nature of the 9-dash line, which is not yet clarified, Indonesia is a party to the South China Sea disputes, kind of indirectly. And that's an important factor because Indonesia is the biggest player in the region. Now I'm going to just wrap up here. We have to also give credit to the Trump administration because in addition to the regularized freedom of navigation operations, we also saw expansion of military aid to countries, including to the Philippines over the past 3 years, I think doubling of that. We also see the US Coast Guard more directly involved for the first time since Cold War in these waters, including in the Taiwan Straits over the past 3 years. I think build infrastructure initiative is good so far, but I think the public diplomacy part is missing. The Chinese are generally better in terms of getting more bang out of imaginary buck because a lot of investment they promised the Philippines is not there, while the US and other countries, including Japan especially, have significant investments in this part of the world. If you look at the surveys, US is still preferred by majority of countries as the leader in Asia Pacific. And I think the way forward here is very important for US and other major powers to emphasize that the discussion of the Indo-Pacific, the discussion of quadrilateral alliance is not coming at the expense of ASEAN, that there's a complementarity rather than a supplementarity dimension to that. I think this is very important. Also is important is capacity building assistance to ASEAN countries. I think the US Coast Guard and our counterparts in India, Japan, Australia, and others are doing a very good job in terms of building capacity and ISR, especially capacity. I think European friends could be much more helpful in that front. We're not talking about billions, you're just talking about millions of dollars at most. Now, lastly, I think we have to have a floor. Our good friend Don Emerson from Stanford consistently talks about this. We all have to agree, no matter what is our threat perception of China or what is our perception of US role in this region, that no single country has to have sole control in the South China Sea, which is an international water. And it's interesting to hear Prime Minister Mahathir talking about demilitarization of the area, which I think should be more focused on China. He doesn't say it, but I think that's what we should say in his behalf. And Jokowi, interestingly, 2 years ago, talked about the possibility of joint patrols by non-claimant states of ASEAN within the South China Sea. Again, this is just in the realm of rhetoric, but for Jokowi to say that in itself, for me, is relevant because it's a recognition that there is a problem there and that there should be an effort by other countries, non-claimant countries, to keep the situation under control. And lastly, we are now nearing towards the conclusion of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. But in my opinion, whatever that Code of Conduct is going to be, because we have no idea what it's going to be. I was just in China 2 months ago, and it seems even they don't know what they want from the Code of Conduct, and we're just back and forth on that. We're just congratulating having titles and outlines for the past 20 years. But I think what's more important than a Code of Conduct is to have the so-called triple freeze. There has to be a freeze in militarization, reclamation, and naval exercises. There's no point in negotiating a diplomatic document if China is changing the facts on the ground on a daily basis. That is the unfair situation that we have to stop. So I'll keep it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Sorry.
Richard's just flown in from the Philippines, and if you can see he moves very fast, his brain and his body. If you do get quarantined, I have no doubt you'll be able to write a book in the 14 days or 28 days.
I learned Chinese too.
Yeah, absolutely. We're delighted to have John Lien from Australia. He's a senior fellow here at Hudson, but before that, he was the National Security Advisor, the Senior National Security Advisor to Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, prolific author, including the second of 2 great reports released out of Hudson in the last couple of months on the Chinese economy and what to do about it. So, John, and I think we're just going to stay seated for the rest of this panel.
Thank you, Patrick, and it's great to be on this panel with colleagues and regional colleagues as well. And thank you, Dr. Nagao, for inviting me to contribute a chapter to this great publication. Of course, I'm no longer in government, so I don't speak for the Australian government. This is an Australian giving an Australian view, but I do deal closely still with our government. But these are my own thoughts. I thought I'd spend really 5 minutes speaking about some of the Australian views and concerns, and we can dig deeper into some of the issues I raised either through this panel or through questions. I think it's fair to say over the past 2 or 3 years, maybe longer, 4 years or so, Australia has shifted from a position where we were largely hedging, and by hedging I mean we were just looking at expanding or maximising our long-term strategic options. So we've moved from largely hedging and managing our relationship and alliance with the United States to a much more proactive countering role and a balancing role, particularly against China. In fact, just two days ago, I think we announced a very significant upgrade to our base in the Northern Territory, which is jointly shared with American forces. Now, the base that we have at the moment, it only currently hosts 2,000 troops, American troops, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's not the significance. Significance is that we're upgrading the base to host American assets, and particularly American heavy military assets such as bombers and F-35s, etc. And this gives you a very clear indication as to where Australia is going. More broadly, and of course the Australian government wouldn't use this language, but I would, we see ourselves as the southern anchor of the American alliance system, and we see Japan as the northern or northeastern anchor of the American alliance system. Now, on that basis, if you look at the geography, Southeast Asia is the geographic and in some senses the strategic heart of the Indo-Pacific. And by the way, we moved to the Indo-Pacific construct 2 years ago, which has significance. It used to be East Asia in our strategic thinking. Now it is Indo-Pacific, which widens the strategic map in a way that I think favours us, brings in India, and of course, it's not completely aimed at China, but China is a very relevant factor there. Southeast Asia, we do see, quite frankly, as the soft underbelly in the region for a number of reasons. One, from a pure capacity point of view, Southeast Asia might be a region with almost a dozen states, but each of those states have a limited capability in and of itself to engage in any significant balancing or countering activities. And as a result, Southeast Asian states tend to hedge rather than balance against Chinese activities. Now, in my view, much of Southeast Asia, and I make the exception in general terms of Vietnam, Indonesia, and what I hope will be a post-Duterte Philippines, I think much of Southeast Asia has or is falling into quite a debilitating fatalism about the inevitability of Chinese dominance, both at an intellectual level but also at a practical level. Much of Southeast Asia, and it's reflected in a lot of things that ASEAN has done, in my view, much of Southeast Asia, and this is of concern to Australia, much of Southeast Asia has normalised Chinese coercion. In a sense, it's baked in the notion of Chinese coercion and assertiveness into expectations of the present and the future. It sees Chinese assertiveness and coercion as something that will just always occur because that's the way China is, and it must be managed rather than opposed. And I see this reflected, even though this is in a diplomatic context, but with consequences, I see this reflected in the whole ASEAN's approach to the Code of Conduct negotiations. Now, everyone right from the beginning knew the Code of Conduct would not result in any binding prescriptions on any powers. Yet, from our point of view, what did ASEAN do? ASEAN fell into the trap of trying to negotiate a Code of Conduct with China. And this occurred while a few things were happening. One, as Richard mentioned, it would have been fine if everyone said, we'll put a freeze on activities, but China didn't do that. They used it as diplomatic cover to continue to extend its control and militarise its artificial features in the South China Sea. So the Code of Conduct really just gave China diplomatic cover to do what it wants to do with apparent ASEAN backing or inadvertent ASEAN backing. The second reason why we're so concerned about the Code of Conduct is that its terms of reference were on China's terms. So rather than, for example, emphasise the role that international law and the arbitration decision had to play in any future diplomatic agreement, it basically fell into China's trap. It doesn't really mention international law. It's more about some negotiated agreement with China, which is precisely what China wants. It wants to negate the relevance of international law and come up with a negotiated agreement. So I think ASEAN fell into that trap. The third thing I think the Code of Conduct did is that it inadvertently entrenched this notion that the South China Sea is an issue between ASEAN nations and China. when in fact countries like Japan, the United States, and Australia have an intrinsic interest in what happens in the South China Sea. So I remembered my time in government and now post-government. I often receive a lot of pushback from my Southeast Asian friends about, why should Australia or the United States or Japan have more of a role in negotiating some kind of understanding? Well, my response is, well, only 4 or 5 ASEAN members are actually claimant states, right? So 5 to 6 ASEAN members are not claimant states, just as Australia, United States, Japan are not claimant states. So if every country has an inherent interest in what happens to the South China Sea, why should we begin on the basis that it should only be an ASEAN-China issue? Now, I would feel a lot more comfortable with that situation if I felt that ASEAN wasn't falling into Chinese traps. And look, by no means is any of this fatal or irreversible, but I do worry that our ASEAN friends, as an organisation and individual countries, are falling into that Chinese trap. This brings me to the point about our views of the United States, and particularly the Trump administration. And as many of you know, Australia, along with Japan, have been the most robust supporters of a tougher or more disruptive Trump foreign policy in our part of the region. And I use that word disruption deliberately because from our point of view, because China had, in a sense, normalised its coercive activities, any counter is going to be, by definition, disruptive. But if you can't handle disruption or if you're not prepared for disruption, then there can be no countering of Chinese activities. So from that point of view, it's not that we like disruption, but we felt that disruption was necessary. And Patrick mentioned that a lot of the strategic thinking and operational thinking occurred before the Trump administration, and I think that's absolutely correct. I don't give the Trump administration all the credit, but where I do give it the credit is that we have an administration that is prepared psychologically to tolerate risk of action in countering China, which at the very top, which I don't attribute to the previous administration. So I remember my time in government, we had great conversations with the Obama administration about what to do about things, but when it came to the very top, there was no appetite for disruption or the unintended consequences of pushing back against China. So having said that, we tend to support the Trump's approach to China, but there are caveats. The first, which Richard, I think Patrick raised as well, is that the biggest mistake that the administration has made is to just withdraw from the TPP because it eliminates the economic centerpiece of any pushback or shaping strategy. And if you look at one of the weaknesses of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, now if you ask particularly Southeast Asians, do you like equality, sovereign rights and privileges, rule of law, freedom from coercion, they all say, of course we do. We're small states, so of course they like it. But if you look at the alternative Chinese proposition, the alternative Chinese proposition is, hey, you may not like us, and yes, we admit we are Sinocentric or hierarchical in our view, but if you sign up to our hierarchical world or global order or regional order, we will offer you guaranteed special gains and access to opportunity. Right? So what I'm trying to say is that when you go around a region now, the Chinese largely don't even deny that their view of the region is hierarchical, but what they're saying is if and when we return to preeminence in the region, if you come up with a special relationship with us, you'll benefit, and you'll benefit in specific material ways. If you don't, then you will miss out. So for a lot of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Singapore, which is still a developing low or middle income region, it's very attractive for the short-term gains or the apparent short-term gains that China can offer. So we, in Australia, for example, we can talk till we're blue in the face to Southeast Asians about why you shouldn't sign up to a particular agreement or a particular aspect of BRI, but the reality is that often we don't have the capability or even the framework to offer you some tangible, offer Southeast Asian countries a tangible material short-term gain. And what we're finding is many Southeast Asian countries are inadvertently making short-term decisions, which they see as tactical or pragmatic, but they have long-term consequences, which favour China rather than any other country. So I think clearly that economic approach, particularly Southeast Asia, is probably one of the weaknesses so far of this administration. Finally, I talked about the virtues of a more disruptive approach to the region by the United States, but let me qualify that by saying Australia is a medium-sized country. All the other smaller and medium-sized countries need an element of predictability, particularly allies, from their superpower ally. They also need to know what the institutional landing spot of where all of this is going. So one of the weaknesses, I think, of the current administration is that they don't really tell us, allies and like-minded countries, where the institutional or what the intended institutional outcome of any kind of negotiation or tension will be, or even whether there is an institutional outcome. And Australia, despite how robust we are behind the Americans, we do kind of need to know what an enduring landing spot on various issues look like, and this is particularly the case with the economic tensions between United States and China. So Patrick, I'll end there and happy to talk about.
Thank you very much, John. So Richard has just flown in from Manila. John has just flown in from Sydney. The rest of us have just walked down the hall here. That's why we've gone in this order, but they're no less illustrious. And our colleague, Dr. Liselott Odgaard, visiting senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute from Denmark, has written extensively about Europe's role in general in the Indo-Pacific, not to mention other places like the Arctic. So Liselott, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Satoru Nagao, for inviting me to present my chapter. I've been asked to write about Europe, and I would argue that Europe is faced with an ally that is increasingly skeptical of Europe's contributions, its role in trade, and its contributions to the transatlantic alliance. And it's also a US ally that focuses increasingly on its Asian partners and looks not so much to Europe. But I actually think that has had a lot of positive consequences because it has been a wake-up call for Europe, a bit rough, but a wake-up call for Europe to realize that they have to be able to operate more independently and do it through the existing European institutional framework, because one small country is not able to exercise sovereignty in a world of US-Chinese sovereignty. So actually, at this moment, despite Brexit's support for Europeans working together through the institutions is greater than we have seen for many decades. And that is partially a consequence of the US pressures on Europe. My main argument would be that it has also made Europe realize that it is not wise to just think that we have common values with the Americans, and because we have common liberal values economically and politically, we will always be good friends. There are differences between Europe and the United States, for example, in its preference for working through multilateral institutional frameworks and for prioritizing comprehensive multilateral free trade agreements that puts Europe and the US at odds at times. And that means that Europe has realized it has to define what is more narrowly in Europe's interests and what isn't. And this increasing focus on interests rather than merely relying on values, I think, is a healthy process, but because it will help clarify where can Europe and the US cooperate and where are there differences that means that maybe they have to look to other partners, or at least there's something to talk about. That doesn't necessarily weaken the alliance. I think in a way it strengthens it because it will make it clear where do we have common interests that we can pursue. Putting European interests first is then one of the sort of developments that we see in Europe. Just as the US has signaled it will put US interests first, so Europe is increasingly signaling that European interests comes first. That also means that Europe is looking to diversify its partnership, not relying so much on the US, but these partners are by and large allies and strategic partners of the United States. So they would be a country such as Japan, it would be South Korea, it would be the ASEAN member states, it would be Australia, all of which have good relations with the US, but also have some reservations in recent years about US putting its own interests first. And I think that's a very healthy process, again, because for one thing, it will prevent the US and China from sort of determining the rules of the road. So if they can sort out their differences, they can decide how things should work globally. That cannot happen if the others partner up without the great powers. And also, I think it will push the US and China to take seriously these countries' preference for comprehensive free trade agreements, TPP was mentioned, for example, and for multilateral institutional cooperation. Then you can say, does Europe matter at all in the Indo-Pacific, and do they have any role to play? I think they have a lot of leverage, and they're starting to use that leverage. It mainly stems from the fact that Europe has a position as a trade heavyweight globally. It's a major trading partner of both the United States and China. The US is the EU's largest trading partner, and China its second largest trading partner. And once Europe starts to use that leverage, it will make a difference not only in its own region, but beyond that. Europe continues to prefer transatlantic cooperation over other partnerships. And that is still because we share a common preference for loads of liberal principles that other countries do not to the same extent. So while this cannot be the sole basis for the transatlantic alliance, of course it continues to be important, provided that both sides acknowledge that their policies may be more complementary at times. So even if the US has a preference for using hard power and Europe has a preference for using diplomacy and institutions, sometimes more than the US, these can in many cases be seen as complementary effort that can work towards the same objectives. And provided that is taken seriously, I'm confident that the transatlantic alliance will remain close and will work towards common goals in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So in a way, because of these shared values, Europe remains the most reliable and capable partner in pushing back against China, also because it's one of the only global economic powers that the US can partner up with. The shared transatlantic identity aligns the US and Europe regarding fundamental objectives that we should not forget are important. For example, Europe and the US agree that economic prosperity must rely on competition rather than on monopolistic behavior and state support. They agree that socio-political stability comes from information sharing and freedom of expression rather than surveillance and oppression. And Security must be built through freedom of movement and mutual defense obligations rather than spheres of influence and coercion. I think that transatlantic differences are mainly instrumental, and there is a lot of low-hanging fruit to be picked if we focus on complementarity between the US and Europe. For example, European economic security and defense partnerships with Asian powers can build a network across the Indo-Pacific that will constitute quite a formidable force for a free and open Indo-Pacific, and it can also open avenues for coordinating infrastructure projects to push back or deliver alternatives to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. The establishment of independent European defense forces that is sometimes criticized by Washington, I think is key to Europe's ability to operate autonomously and independently from the US. And this is precisely the sort of ally that the US needs at a time where it wants to, push more responsibility over onto its allies. And Europe, I think, is well positioned to do this. It will take some time, maybe a decade or two. This is not something you do overnight. But France has taken the lead in these efforts, and slowly but surely, this kind of force is developing. And there is also a European military footprint in the Indo-Pacific, which is supported by an increasing number of countries. Again, I think this strengthens the transatlantic alliance rather than weakens it. So focusing on these complementarity issues, I think will be key to strengthening transatlantic relations.
Excellent points. I'm sorry that we keep running over time. That's my fault as a moderator because there's a lot to say, and it's a big region. But while Dr. Odgaard has recently sailed through on an aircraft carrier through the Indian Ocean, the one resident big power of the Indian Ocean is India. So it's very important to let Dr. Aparna Panda, the director of the Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia here at Hudson, talk from her perspective, not least because we've got this another important summit meeting coming up with President Trump preparing to go to India. There's a good article in the National Review today by our colleagues Tom Disterberg and Eric Brown, but Aparna.
Thank you, Patrick, and especially thank you, Nagao-san. I will try not to be Indian, and I will sort of try and keep my my talk as brief as possible because I know I'm the last speaker and I'm between you and Q&A. So 5 quick points. One, interestingly, we have a Quad Plus here actually, if we include Philippines and Europe. Which is interesting, but it sort of speaks to the fact that sort of how far we have come, I would say, in the last 5 years, not just the last 10 years. Secondly, even though, population-wise, India is the largest in the country along with China and the Indo-Pacific, we are not an ally. So sort of, I've in many ways changed what I was going to say after hearing the first 3 speakers. People who are talking about how US has changed its policy, US hasn't done enough, and therefore they need to maybe play a bigger role. India actually is very comfortable with the Indo-Pacific because we don't like institutional arrangements. We don't like security partnerships. We don't like being forced into something where we don't have an option, and maybe where we'll be forced to do something where others want us to do it. So the fuzzier Indo-Pacific remains, the happier Delhi remains. That said, Indo-Pacific helps us, one, because it helps build a relationship not just with the United States, but with older partners like Japan, ASEAN. At every speech, Prime Minister Modi has said that ASEAN centrality is key to Indo-Pacific, because India would like Southeast Asian countries to feel reassured that India's entry into the region is not to try and overwhelm them. And with Australia and Europe as well. Third, India views China as a rival right from the 1950s. That has not changed. India has lost a war with China. China has deepened its economic and military presence in every country of South Asia, which hurts India's interests. However, India does not want China as an enemy. India does not have the economic or military capability to stand up to China. So with Indo-Pacific, while India is a part of it and believes in all the shared principles, India has two concerns. One is geographical, which is that from India's point of view, the Middle East and sort of the area to India's west is as important as the area to India's east. So Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Gulf, which technically come under Central Command and not Pacific Command, and therefore not Indo-Pacific, is something which India would like to be changed. India would like that region to be as important as East and as South China Sea. Second part of that is Indo-Pacific is more maritime. India's concerns with China are more land-based. So India's concern is that if there's something happens in the maritime domain, there are a number of countries. What happens if the next India-China conflict is on the land border, which has happened in the past? And therefore, India is reluctant to sort of confront China too openly when it knows that it may be forced to confront China on its own. And finally, India is a country which, unlike most other American allies or Western allies, does not want another country as a security provider. India does not need an American umbrella or a Western umbrella. What India would like to do is actually project power in its region. That is what India would like to do. And sort of ideally, other countries would like India to do that as well. But as of now, we don't have the economic or military capability to do it. We would like to build that in the next 5 to 10 years so that India can be an Indian Ocean power as it's always wanted to. I will stop there now and happy to answer any questions, Q&A.
Excellent, very good. This great panel discussion with Dr. Nagao, who can go up to the microphone. All of us are available for questions, and what we're going to do with the rest of the 22 minutes we have remaining on this program is to take questions from the audience, or absent those questions, I'll be happy to fill in and ask questions and talk. So if there's anybody who'd like to ask, please raise your hand. There's a microphone over here, and we have one right here. And why don't we start all the way on this side right here? Oh, we got two microphones. Okay. No waiting, please. If you just identify yourself, Vic, and ask a question or make a comment.
Okay, thank you. Big Chen, University of Antwerp, and former visiting fellow at the East-West Center. So I have a question for Dr. Hogarth. So you know that right now the United States is very much concerned about its trade deficit with Vietnam. So as the EU-Vietnam free trade agreement is moving forward, is the EU concerned about the potential trade deficit with Vietnam? Thank you. Potential trade deficit with Vietnam.
Trade deficit.
Oh, okay.
Right. And we're going to take a few questions and save this up, but we'll go right here and we'll just keep going down the line here.
Thank you. I'm Chi Ninh Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. This question is for Dr. Cronin. Regarding the U.S. policy, yesterday at the U.S. Security and Economic Commission, Admiral Blair made it clear that the U.S. has no consistent and clear policy in the South China Sea. And he also made it clear that I heard Dr. Panda said today that the U.S. and India has not yet come to a clear relationship at the top, especially in military projection in the Indo-Pacific Ocean. You point out a lot of recommended policies, and I heard from all the panelists that there are concerns because of U.S. ambivalent policies, inconsistent, TPP was withdrew, and reservation from the EU and partners and allies.
All right.
As the one who worked very long and hard on U.S. policy, what do you think we need to do? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We're going to take these two other questions. Was right next to you first, and then here. We'll take those two, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. The question for Ms. Hogarth. What do you think about the difference between United States and EU on the issue of 5G Huawei equipment? How will that impact this alliance? Yeah.
Big question. And yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Hyun Kim at Voice of America, and I want to have a question regarding the GSOMIA issue. So, as you know, there is a upcoming defense leaders talk next Monday between United States and Korea. So, to Cronin, what is the best conclusion or optimal way for the conclusion or for the GSOMIA extension or resuming? Yeah, including the thought is possible. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to begin then. The intelligence sharing agreement, known as the GSOMIA acronym, that exists between South Korea and Japan is vital for Korean, Japanese, and U.S. interests, because without real-time, constant intelligence sharing in the missile age, there could be catastrophe. So it was very important for Seoul and Tokyo to not rip up this agreement, as they were on the cusp of doing a few weeks ago, but rather to reaffirm its long-standing sort of need, not with great fanfare, but just as a matter of technocratic, bureaucratic, operational cooperation between two countries that are not allied with each other, have historical differences, but are America's key allies in Northeast Asia, and share, going back to interests, we all share these basic interests. So put the politics aside and recognize the common interest that it's very important to keep information sharing. Just as it's going to be important across the Indo-Pacific all the way to Europe to have maritime domain awareness, to have the kind of information sharing that will allow us to talk about strategy and policy on tough issues from 5G to trade to security. So this is a constant refrain that we're going to have in the information age we live in. Information sharing is going to be very important. Quickly on the question, and Admiral Blair is a friend, and I have great respect for Admiral Blair. I wonder if I asked Admiral Blair, when did we have this very consistent, pristine policy in the South China Sea? When was that period? Because I don't remember that. The fact is the United States has been fumbling around trying to define exactly, this was an issue that President Duterte was able to use against us, and others, saying you weren't there giving us strong defense, so what was the Philippines going to do? We're not going to stand up to the PLA Navy, and Vietnam, of course, is in a similar boat. But the United States, from a U.S. perspective, wants flexibility. No chief executive, no president, no administration of any party wants to be locked in ahead of time to providing a guarantee without knowing what we're guaranteeing and what's the context. So a strong alliance, including with the U.S.-Japan alliance, it's all about being able to, or NATO, this is really about being able to, or with Australia, there's no guarantee that we go to the defense, but there's a high probability we do. In Article 5, yes, there's a certain automatic, but it's why you need constant engagement and debate. And so what we really need in Southeast Asia is to understand the strategic priority of Southeast Asia, something that gets too short shrift in this town too easily. Whether you're in maritime strategy and you're thinking about the straits and what China, a historic land power, is trying to do, become both a historic dominant land power and a dominant sea power at the same time, riding over the sovereign interests of even big states like Indonesia, but certainly middle-sized ones like Vietnam and the Philippines, that's unacceptable. And we share this common interest. So engagement is the key thing here. The second thing, as I suggested, and I think as John Lee suggested, and I think Richard as well, there's a heavy economic component here. So we are already very strong. We need to stay strong. We need to preserve deterrence. But we need to balance that military strength with the kind of foresight of looking ahead. We want to work and develop the digital economy of this region in the future. We want to be there for decades. We'll have some more programs here in the coming days and weeks. I think you'll be surprised, showing that we are going to be here for decades. We're going to be, talking to Vietnam. We're going to be talking to Indonesia. Yes, we're even going to be working more in the Philippines because Duterte doesn't write the entire relationship of the U.S.-Philippines. And there are opportunities with Malaysia and Australia and Europe and India and Japan and Korea and other countries have huge opportunities to participate in this, and China too, if they're willing to abide by a set of rules that we can hold them accountable to. not cheat on. So I need to stand aside here and let Liselott answer a couple of the questions that were addressed to her.
Thank you for the questions, which, of course, points to the more, potential differences between Europe and the United States. Europe has made it a preference in the past years to stress and go ahead with free trade agreements with Asian countries. So it has done that with a number of other countries, including Japan. In later years. And I think, and it does so following the World Trade Organization's rules. So Europe is using this to show America that this is a key point for Europe, free trade agreements with WTO rules, and it is not very bothered about trade deficits. This is not, in Europe's view, the baseline of a relationship to look at it from that perspective. And so I think it's one of the issues where Europe has been quite active in trying to show the US that Europe will, go a slightly different way. That doesn't mean we don't still both support the basic common market economic rules of the road, but in the implementation of those rules, Europe has a clear preference for institutions and free trade agreements to stay in place. With regard to the 5G, there is, of course, again, the response that the institutions have led or not interfered in this, partly also because they don't actually have power to do that with regard to 5G. So the countries themselves have decided whether they should let Huawei in or not. So my own country, Denmark, have decided to exclude Huawei and go for Ericsson. And other countries have said, they won't exclude Huawei, but they will make sure that they don't get vital information out of it. And the US disputes that that's possible. So the end result, I think, will not be that, security cooperation will end, but of course the US might have some reservations down the road on sharing information with countries that include Huawei in their telecommunications framework. That being said, I think we're in the early days of a Western response to that challenge, and Europe and the US agrees that it's a problematic, that China has used the telecommunications infrastructure in problematic ways, and there is a problem that needs to be dealt with, and that is a challenge. And I think, again, that's the important point here. This is something where Europe and the US agrees, and they're trying to work out a response that can deliver an alternative to Huawei in the end, a competitive and viable alternative. Again, you don't do that overnight, but we've seen from other businesses, for example, the shipbuilding industry in Europe, which has had heavy competition from China, which through unfair trade market economic practices, that industry changed, and it's still viable in Europe. So I think the same will happen in many cases, that the industries and the public sectors of Europe and the US will find alternatives down the road that will mean that we will have, we don't have to rely on Huawei as the cheapest and best solution. Thanks.
I want to ask briefly the other three panelists a quick question, because I'm going to ask Aparna about maybe what might come out or what should come out of a Trump-Modi summit meeting. I want to ask Richard about what's likely to happen on the joint development sort of quest that China and Philippines are facing, because is that going to be a model or is that never going to happen? But I want to first turn to John and ask him maybe to amplify from an Australian perspective on, as a Five Eyes nation, Australia, the United States, the concern on the 5G and how Australia in general is trying to strategically work through these challenges.
This is of quite high importance and interest to Australia, because Australia was really the first country to explicitly ban Huawei from our 5G rollout, which incurred a lot of anger from China. Now, to be fair, Australia could make that decision relatively easily, not just because of intelligence considerations, but because we didn't really have Huawei in our infrastructure, unlike other countries like Britain. So it was a relatively clean from a economic and infrastructure point of view to make that decision. But nevertheless, the decision was made on the merits of intelligence. And so the main concern we have with Britain, obviously, is that they've misunderstood the potential applications of 5G. So Britain sort of said they can confine Huawei to what they call the edge, which not the core, which you can do in 4G and 5G. If 5G fulfills its potential, we believe there's no such thing as an edge and a core, that if you're in any part of the network, no matter how minor, you can actually affect other parts. So that's a technical reason why we disagree with the British view. More generally, with the Five Eyes, look, any agreement, intelligence otherwise, no matter how long-standing, no matter how historical, it tends to degrade over time if the interests of the countries don't align, right? So the broader concern is that if the United Kingdom, for example, takes a fundamentally different view of China's role in the region and the world, invariably that's going to lead to problems with the existing Five Eye configuration. So my personal concern right now, I mean, I don't like the 5G decision that Boris Johnson made. My particular concern is I hope London does not think now that it will try to forge a special relationship with China. I mean, we've all been through, in our region, we've all been through the experience where you try to forge a special relationship with China and it doesn't quite work out. London hasn't really been through that part yet. So my broader concern and imperative would be ensure that this Huawei decision is not a desire by the United Kingdom to forge that special relationship, because that would do structural damage to the Five Eyes.
Excellent. And Richard, you know, when Duterte came to power, I think there's going to be a lot of respect for standing up for Philippine nationalism, and you know, a lot of Americans could understand that. Is he actually getting from China what he sort of claims to be, or are the Chinese pushing around even the Indonesians as well as the Vietnamese, you know, swarming Thitu Island? How do you see this? Because this idea of who's going to jointly develop the resources around Reed Bank, for instance, where there's a rich hydrocarbon supply, is a fundamental question about the rules of the road for the future in this region. So how do you see this going in the next year or the remainder of Duterte's term?
Yeah, I mean, this is where, Patrick, I take issue with the so-called common wisdom. I mean, sure, economics matter, but what kind of economic engagement we're talking about? The first thing that I take an issue with is, for instance, TPP. Symbolically, it makes perfect sense for America to put forward TPP, but on the ground, talking to people in Malaysia, in other countries, there wasn't much excitement about, for instance, giving multinational companies certain kinds of powers that could violate the sovereignty or welfare of people. You know, you don't have to be a leftist in order to buy into some part of that argument. I think it was more important to replace the TPP with something that is more relevant to people, and that is where infrastructure development comes into the picture. And that's the second layer where I take issue with the common wisdom. Everyone talks about, oh, China is transforming the world. The Belt and Road Initiative is everywhere. My question is, in the Philippines, for instance, where are the Chinese projects? Show me. I can show you, yes, online casinos by China and all sorts of dodgy investments by China, sure. But where are the big ticket infrastructure projects? I can show you the Japanese projects. If you look at the Fitch measurement of the projects in places like Vietnam, Japan has more than 2 times. We're talking about like 70 to 20 kind of breakdown. In places like the Philippines, for the 20 Japanese project, you only have 8 Chinese projects, assuming they get into the picture. So I think a lot of us who are semi-critical of China also buy into the Chinese propaganda that China is taking over because they have economic initiatives to put forward. And the third layer is, it was never about matching China on a renminbi to renminbi basis. It was about bringing in quality investment, investments that create jobs for the people, and it was creating sustainable development through that infrastructure development. And I think Malaysia is a very interesting example of that. They have been overwhelmed by actual Chinese investments, but the Mahathir government said, we want a quality of investments. We just don't want any kind of investment, especially if this is corrosive capital that undermines domestic political economy and good governance initiative. I think that's a very important thing. Now, the second major disagreement also I have is when it comes to the code of conduct negotiations between ASEAN and China, the nature of problem actually has changed, right? The idea that code of conduct is just China is just playing along and everything like that, I think that's a snapshot from the past. What we see is a worrying trend and at the same time encouraging pushback. So the field is shifting. So the field has shifted because if you look at the leak outline of the code of conduct, final first draft, single draft of the code of conduct, China suddenly is making new proposals. So for a long time, our concern is it will not be legally binding. So what the hell is the added value? This is DOC essentially. You're reselling us what we already bought, which didn't work 2002 onwards. Now suddenly China is kind of implying that they're fine with legally binding, but whose law, right? Or if it's international law, which interpretation of international law? This is where it's worrying. And even more so, China is injecting new demands, including yes, we can have a legally binding code of conduct, but according to this code of conduct, only us can exploit the resources in the South China Sea. From now on, keep out other countries. Or there could be no military exercises with external powers, obviously US, in the South China Sea. Now, suddenly, you don't want a legally binding code of conduct if it's going to go in that direction. Happily, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries pushed back. So it seems there are at least some more sensible countries in the ASEAN who are saying, wait, China is asking too much, which ties me to your question. The joint development agreement between Philippines and China, even if it's just symbolic, it's important because we're currently supposed to be negotiating code of conduct. The Philippines is the ASEAN-China country coordinator. So China will try to use whatever propaganda or PR they can get out of it and say to the rest of the region, see, the Philippines, supposed US ally who took us to the court is now open to joint development, at least in principle, even if they don't get it. Maybe Vietnam and Malaysia want the same thing, right? So what happens between Philippines and China has implications for the rest of the ASEAN. And luckily or happily or whatever, so far, the problem with the joint development is that it could violate not only Philippine constitution, but also the Philippines' own arbitration award. I don't know how the hell is the Philippine government together with China going to essentially square a triangle. Because according to the Philippine ambassador to China, it has to be consistent with the Chinese constitution, the Philippine constitution, and the arbitration or international law, and by extension, arbitration. So I can see only two outcomes here that could work for China, and they're possible. One outcome is come up with an agreement, half of it is secret. We'll never know about it. They'll release only some sort of outline, but keep the rest secret. And the other one would be the negotiations will go on and they'll get a preliminary deal, and then they could use that to push for the agenda on the level of ASEAN. What I'm saying here is that just discussing the joint development agreement is good for China, no matter what they get out of it in terms of the permutations of result. What should be clear to the Filipino people is that we are negotiating this joint development agreement or whatever it is, essentially under shotgun with a time bomb, right? The time bomb is that the Philippines is going to run out of its own indigenous resources in Malampaya, and the shotgun are the Chinese warships who are there in the area. In that situation, I don't think you can ever get a fair deal out of that. This is what should be clear to the Filipino people and the region.
You're going to be a vital voice on understanding this as we go forward. Aparna is going to get the last word here in terms of trying to think through whether this vast, promising, growing India-U.S. relationship has some effective, handholds that we're actually making progress on and so on. Are we going to start to see something specific and concrete out of this very promising cooperation where there's clear strategic desire? But what do you think?
So the visit itself will be a lot more of optics.
Yes.
As everybody knows about the hundreds of thousands of people, not necessarily millions of people who are going to line the streets.
Millions of people.
Millions of people in the Namaste Modi event in Ahmedabad. However, there are a number of defense deals. I'm sure you follow those, about $5 billion worth of naval helos, helicopters. The US is selling the integrated air defense weapon system and a couple of others which come through. The economic deal may not, as of now. However, it's important to bear in mind that the strategic partnership is not, the India-US strategic partnership is now at a stage where it doesn't really matter who the president or prime minister are. This is the fourth American president back-to-back who's gone to the US, to India, sorry. Two Democrat, two Republican. Similarly, it doesn't matter who the prime minister is, whether it's BJP or Congress or any other party. Every Indian prime minister in the last 2 decades has welcomed US presidents. So it's a strong relationship. It's a strategic one. It needs a lot more effort from both sides. And it's not going to be as easy for each country to navigate it as it used to be, as it was for US to do it with its allies post-World War II. India is a difficult country to work with.
Well, on that note, what a great panel discussion. Dr. Nagao, we thank you again for everything you've done to pull this together. Thank you to this panel. Please thank the panel. Interesting note to end on.